Hi, and welcome to the closing event for IAmRemarkable Week 2024. I'm Sandy Royden, I'm Head of Youth and Families for the NatWest Group, and as a passionate advocate of diversity and inclusion, I'm absolutely delighted to be here with IAmRemarkable and our guest, Sophie, today. IAmRemarkable, what can I say? It's about celebrating achievements, and we're going to talk a bit about that today. Celebrating achievements and diversity and inclusion, and really being advocates for diversity and inclusion. IAmRemarkable is a global movement, and the reach is huge. As you know, those of you who have dialed in, you've gone to 600,000 people across the globe, across 182 countries. NatWest alone has, through its gender network, trained up 20 volunteers on IAmRemarkable workshops. We have launched across 4 countries with over 2,000 participants and over 200 workshops. So well done, NatWest, as well, for celebrating IAmRemarkable. All of this week we've been celebrating IAmRemarkable, and there's been a series of events culminating on this exciting event. So I'm really delighted to get into the detail with Sophie today and have a really nice conversation. The highlight really being that we want to empower people to celebrate their achievements. You know, we all achieve lots of different things, but we're a bit shy about it. So actually, we really want to celebrate the achievements and empowering other people and celebrating other people's achievements as well. I'm absolutely delighted and super excited that Sophie's with us today. She's a leading voice in diversity and inclusion and disability advocacy, using her platform to champion inclusivity and to challenge perceptions, spearheading a number of global movements on the disability agenda. Sophie, I'm going to embarrass you now before I hand over to you in a second. Sophie is best known for presenting the Paralympics. She's a BAFTA-nominated presenter, and her TV work has accumulated across hard-hitting documentaries, live event broadcast, and more recently fronting a primetime travel series. She's also making history, and I cannot wait to hear more about this, as the first disabled woman in the US to host the Paralympics this summer. So we'll talk about a little bit more about that later on. Sophie suffered a spinal cord injury as a result of a car crash at age 18. Today, she's an award-winning advocate for disability rights, has been voted in the top 10 most influential people in the UK for the past 3 years, and she's also on the Special Advisory Board for the Human Rights Watch, patron of disability charity Scope and the Spinal Injuries charity Backup. She now joins us from LA, sunny LA. I wish it was as sunny here, Sophie. It's definitely not as sunny in Scotland. She now lives in LA, having moved from the UK. So welcome, Sophie. Hi, morning.
Morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello.
Yeah, hello. Lovely to see you again. Lovely.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, very well.
I love it. Thank you.
Sorry if I've made you blush, but you have got a very big list of achievements. And as this week is about celebrating achievements, why not?
It's a nice way to start the day, is have someone else read out some of the things that you've achieved. Maybe it's something we should all try and do. Remind ourselves. Yeah, thank you.
Think so. That's great. Well, I'm going to get stuck into it because I'm desperate to ask you lots of questions. I know our audience will be as well. Maybe if I start, Sophie, maybe could you just talk a little bit about your background and your early life? I mentioned there you had an accident and had a very severe injuries at a very young age. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that, if that's okay, and maybe where you've come from and to?
Okay, so yes, when I was 18 years old, which is 21 years ago this summer, I was just leaving school and I had just celebrated my A-level results. So I'd received the results and it was the summer, it was August, and I had gone up to Scotland to collect those results. And I was driving home from a party and unfortunately in the drive home, even though it was very short, I lost control of the car. And in the crash, I did a lot of damage to my face, my skull, my eye, my nose, all sorts of parts of me. And then in the impact, the seatbelt that was running across my chest, as it should do, held me tight. But unfortunately, in that impact, the seatbelt sort of held me so tight that one part of me twisted and the other part didn't. And my vertebrae rotated. And in that moment, I was instantly paralyzed from the chest down. So I was rushed to hospital and I was in rehabilitation in a spinal injuries unit for about 4 months. and I came out the other side as a full-time wheelchair user, and have not had any change in my prognosis since. So I've been living now for, as I said, 21 years almost, as a manual wheelchair user and a paraplegic. Of course, everything in an instant changed at that moment. So all of my plans for my life, even though they weren't that concrete because I was so young, all of the dreams and all of the goals did go out the window. And everything started afresh. So I often refer to myself as sort of having a very distinctive division in my life. My girlhood, my childhood was just non-disabled, and then my adult life has been disabled. So it's been this kind of division, and it's been a real journey. Since, I mean, a very complicated and fascinating but brilliant journey.
Yeah, amazing. And I guess if I turn to, clearly you had a very successful career in broadcasting. Did you always want to go into broadcasting? So I'm interested in, you talked there about, your life changed in that moment. Was that the plan, or has that come since?
Absolutely not the plan. So I didn't really know what I could or could not achieve after I had my injury. I often I explain it in a sense that when I became disabled, I had a lot of internalized ableism about what someone like me or someone who looked like me was able to do. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really know how to address that or unpack it. It was quite internalized, sort of unconscious. So my goals for myself at that age, at that time, I really didn't know how to set them. I didn't know what disabled people could do. I didn't know what wheelchair users could do. I didn't know what women who use wheelchairs could do. I just was really clueless. But the one thing I loved more than anything was painting and drawing. And as I was still able to do that, it was a sort of, I suppose, something that came with me from the former life. I thought, you know what, I can still do that. And I love it so much. Why don't I go and do that? Because my intention had been to go to law school. And that's what I got the grades to do. And that's what the plan had been. But that all went out the window when I woke up after having nearly died and just thought, you know what, you only get one life. Live it the way that you want to. And so I went to art school. And I loved art school. But whilst I was there, I got a phone call from the occupational therapist who'd been looking after me when I was in rehabilitation, saying that the BBC were looking for some people to take part in this expedition across Nicaragua. So going from one coast to the other on foot as a group of disabled people, which is absolutely, I think, possibly the most extraordinary thing to set as a goal at that early point in my career, in my journey as a disabled person. I was so clueless as to what I couldn't do at that point, but I was so determined to prove to myself and others that I could do this thing, that I could still be who I was before. So off I went. I auditioned and got a place as a contributor on the show. And I had a massive wake-up call. It was incredibly challenging to be in that environment as a disabled person, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. But what really I came away with was this awakening to the fact that being a broadcaster would give me a voice and would allow me to showcase the reality of living with a disability, both good and bad, because I had become almost invisible overnight. Because when you become disabled, I think you really recognize just how differently you get treated. And I didn't like how I was being treated, but I did like what I was learning about disability. And as I said earlier, I had a lot to unlearn and a lot to learn. And as I was learning that, I wanted to show people about it. I wanted to almost say, hey, did you know that wheelchair users can do all this stuff? And it's brilliant. And I was on this sort of steep learning curve. And I thought that television would give me a voice to be able to talk about it. But unfortunately, at the time, it was really hard to get into broadcasting. There wasn't much opportunity for wheelchair users. There was a few people who'd broken through, but it was very few and far between. And often it was only on things that were to do with disability. And it was just still very complicated, the representation. So as a result, I went back to art school. And then eventually, I think it was 10 years later, that I got a real opportunity to work in TV. And then I haven't looked back.
Wonderful. What a journey. And what a true test of strength and grit as well, actually, just to have that opportunity and go for it in that moment. It was really quite pivotal by the sounds of it, that moment.
I don't know. It's funny, isn't it, Sandy? Because you never know at the time what these milestone events are. You don't know. Sometimes your intuition can guide you and you can go, I think this might be a crossroads here. and this might change your direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both good and bad. But sometimes you just don't know. And I don't think I knew then that would change everything. I thought it would change things for me in a different way. I thought it would allow me to see that actually there's a whole load of world out there that I can still access. That's not what I learned. I actually came away quite heartbroken by the fact that naivety was, needed to be checked. There was a lot of environments I was not going to thrive in, but there was things I did come away from that show, from that experience that, changed a lot. And I would always say to anyone who's kind of unsure about this, like, how do I know whether I should make these decisions? And it sounds scary, but I'm always like, just do it. Face the fear, do it anyway. Because I think that's served me well over the years. I think fear can be a real barrier to progress. And unfortunately, as a wheelchair user, I've got enough barriers as it is. So if I add my fear into that, then that's just a double whammy, a double barrier to overcome. So I often find if I'm scared of something, I do it because there's, a cap on how many things I can do. And so if that fear gets in the way of the things I can do, that's a crying shame. So, yeah.
Yeah. And we often get in our own way, right? I think sometimes, and it's true of a lot of people. I think, I can reflect on my own, life as well. And I think, gosh, I sometimes get in my own way. And to your point, there's enough challenges, right? So,
And I think that's a great thing to have learned so young. I was 18. I think that idea of actually understanding, oh, wait, hold on, I'm the person stopping me from doing this. There was enough of the sort of additional barriers being presented to me, physical and attitudinal, people saying, you can't do that. And then physically not being able to do things. And I think when I realized that if I added myself into that mix of naysayers and doubters and limited beliefs and all of that, then that would be a disservice to myself. So it became a kind of, and I think I've been learning it for the last 20 years now. How do I know when this is something that I can do and it's just me getting in the way, or it's actually not realistic and don't waste my time, or this is just an ingrained assumption? And this goes not just for being a disabled person. This could be as a woman, or it doesn't matter. It could be about your age. It could be a number of things. We have these kind of limitations that we put on ourselves, and we buy that. And I often think it's really important we check in and make sure, do we actually agree with that? Or should we push ourselves forward? And
Totally agree. And you've talked there about some of the challenges really in a really eloquent way, actually, in terms of just being brave and going for it. What have been some of the biggest challenges, would you say, Sophie?
I'd say, so I did kind of mention it there, that I kind of put it into two groups. That there's the physical barriers, which as a wheelchair user are perhaps really obvious. The lack of a physical access into a space, no ramps or small narrow doors, or not many accessible facilities, toilets, etc. The obvious, I suppose, or certainly the obvious if you know anyone who's a wheelchair user. The ones that are more insidious and harder to tackle and to identify are the attitudinal ones, and they are internal, as I've said, but they really are absolutely everywhere, and it comes in many different guises. It can be from meeting someone for the first time, say a taxi driver, or even perhaps you're in an elevator or a lift and somebody, attention please, attention. Oh, you okay? So a fire alarm, and sort of that person interrupting your daily life with inquisitive and judgmental questions that reveal to me their attitude about what I can do. So, oh God, what happened to you, you poor thing? That sort of stuff. That sits on a spectrum, a sort of sliding scale of attitudinal beliefs around disability, that it's a really bad thing to have happen and that it's the worst and that you're pitiful. On the other end of it, of course, are people who are outright discriminatory and refuse you entry into places. Or, I learned very quickly when I was talking about, I went back to art school. I was actually told I couldn't go to art school because they hadn't made the campus accessible. And I had applied before my injury. And so when I deferred a year, had my injury, had deferred, went back, and I came back as a wheelchair user, and they said, sorry, we can't give you a place here. There's no access. And that was my wake up call. My gosh, this is a college and it's not accessible. So I didn't realize how much I'd need to know my rights until that moment. Of course, I do know now, and I flex them regularly. It's one of the reasons why I've moved to America, because the rights here, the laws here are so much more robust. But to your question about what's the hardest, I think it's always been other people's attitudes. Because, for example, tackling the problem of the physical access, that is a choice. That college could choose to make their campus accessible, preempting that there might be a student who has an access requirement. They choose not to. They wait until somebody pushes them, or the law pushes them, or they're forced to. That's an attitudinal barrier. The others, when people say things like, oh, you can't do that, or you can't be here. Again, that's very obvious. People are putting their ideas of what you can do on you. And they've been really hard, because sometimes they don't manifest in the most obvious of ways, and they're implicit in something, but not explicit. And that's when I go, hold on, where's this coming from? Is this a discriminatory response to me being here, to people like me being here? And that happens all the time. In fact, it happens on a daily basis. And so I'd say over the years, I've learned how to spot it effectively and know which battles to pick, because that's the hard part. When you're young and and when I say young, I mean early in your disability journey, or literally young in age, I think you just want to take on every single battle that you can, or every single battle becomes too impossible. So you do none, all or nothing. Yeah. And I think I've learned over the years which ones to pick and which ones to put my energy into.
Yeah, where to spend your energy. Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And I guess the one thing I'm very cognizant of is you're a huge role model for a lot of people. But that comes with pressure, right? I guess. How do you handle some of that pressure, Sophie?
Thank you. So it's a complicated response I think I have to this, because on the one hand, I find being a role model isn't something I don't think anyone sets out to do. Well, certainly I didn't set out to do. What I wanted was, like I said earlier, to sort of find a voice that I knew I had, and I just needed to be heard for good and bad reasons. Like I wanted it, for example, going to college and being told you're not able to come here. Who do you complain to? Now, when something bad happens to me, say, for example, my wheelchair gets broken by an airline, which it did last year, I talk about it, people listen, because I have built a platform, and I did that deliberately. So television has become my advocacy tool, and I use it appropriately. So if I become a role model as a result, that's amazing. But really for me, it's about shining a light onto the lived experience of a group of people that so often get overlooked. To your question about responsibility, I do feel a huge responsibility, because there's so few of us with the platform. It's growing, of course, and thankfully in the UK, my gosh, there's many, many, many more than when certainly I became disabled 20 years ago. There's definitely there are household names who are of people who identify as disabled, and people with a far, far, far greater following than me that do use their platforms to do good and help as well. And it does, I think, come with a responsibility, because we don't have enough of us. And I'm not representative of a complete community, but I do try, when given the opportunity to speak, to share our lived experience authentically. And yeah, it's come with a responsibility, because there are a number of us out there. We are the largest minority in the world, but yet we are the most overlooked. And I think I feel it every day. I get direct messages on my social media asking for help for things. And what do I do in this situation? How do I do that? Because people have read about some of the things I've done, and it's like, okay, it comes with a responsibility for sure, but that's okay. That's okay, the nature of the beast.
Yeah, impact as well, right? Which is amazing, because the impact that you have is huge. So I'm interested in, you must have had a number of kind of setbacks along the way. Is there anything notable, a kind of setback that you've had and you've thought, God, that was a bit of a moment? And how did you overcome it?
So the thing about spinal cord injury, or actually many disabilities and chronic health conditions, is that they fluctuate. They aren't sort of set. And whilst my spinal injury, as I said earlier, hasn't actually changed in 20 years, the secondary complications that come with spinal cord injury vary and occur at different times. And one of the problems I have is because I'm sat all the time, if I get any wounds or injuries or anything in areas that we call pressure areas, so the areas where I'm sitting, so underneath when you're sitting, wherever your bum, the back of your legs, the back of your knees, the back of your feet, for example, those are pressure areas.
Mm-hmm.
And if you get any wounds in those areas, then you have to do everything you can to relieve pressure to allow those wounds to heal. And unfortunately, when I was 19, I didn't know much about that. I'd only been injured a hot minute, I think a year in, and I got a splinter from a pub bench on my right bum cheek. And I didn't know it was there because I can't feel that part of my body anymore. And unfortunately, that splinter went unnoticed for long enough to form an infection in my skin, and I was rushed to hospital. And overnight, the sort of abscess that had formed was removed. And it was like, without being too graphic, it was like an ice cream scoop had been removed from the middle of my right bum cheek. Now, for anyone else, that would be painful, but uncomfortable, but manageable. But for a wheelchair user who can't sit on a wound, that was devastating. And unfortunately, I spent, long story short, the best part of 3 years lying on my stomach. I had to leave art school. I had to basically quit my life for 3 years. And between the ages of 19 and 21, lie on my stomach. And it was torturous for me as a very active person. And that, unfortunately, that wound left a scar. And that scar is in a vulnerable position because it's right in the middle of where I sit. And unfortunately, every now and again, because I live a very active life, I bang that scar when I transfer onto something, and it flares up and it irritates, and then I have to go back onto bed rest. So every so often it will happen, and I have to go lie on my stomach again for a month, for 6 months, and it's just very disruptive. I live in fear of it. So I have a lot of setbacks, and the way I get over them every time is to always hold on to the hope that it will pass. And I just know that the other side of it will feel all the better. It's almost like I see my life as a roller coaster. The ups are so high. My life now is when it's good, I've curated it to be the best life I could possibly have. I live now in LA. I have the best job. I have wonderful friends. I'm really lucky in my life because I've made it the way I want it to be. So the highs are very high, but the lows are very, very, very low. So when all that gets just taken away and I'm stuck and I'm in pain and I'm lying on my stomach and my work gets in jeopardy, everything's thrown up in the air, I always just hold on to the hope that when the minute this fixes, I'll pick up the pieces because I've done it several times now, and I'll move on and it will feel even better. And I've realized that the highs and lows, those polarities have got even further apart. And so I live with a lot of joy because it's sort of the flip side of the suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And mentally, that's tough. What you've talked there about kind of looking to the other side and knowing you're going to come out of the other side, but it takes a lot of grit and resilience to do what you've just described. I mean, is there any tips you would share in terms of, when it gets mentally tough, how do you dig deep? And
I think somebody said this to me once, and I thought it was really powerful. It's a shame to have resilience. Resilience is learned through suffering and getting on with it, and that's tough. Resilience is a hard thing to have, but when you have it, it is your armor, and it gets you through so much. And I'd say, for me, mentally, the resilience has been honed over years and years and years. It's not something you can just get, like that. It takes time. And I think for anybody who's wanting to know how to get through the dark pages, it's almost like for dark stages, it's that concept of kind of the trusting that you don't know what you can do until you do it. And I always say this. People say to me often, gosh, I mean, it's a weird thing to say. In fact, it's a harmful thing to say. But they'll say, I couldn't live if I had a disability like yours. I couldn't live like that. I couldn't do what you do. I don't know how you do it. And I'm often quite shocked by that. But also I kind of get it, because I have to say, if somebody had said to me as a teenager, you're going to end up paralyzed and never be able to walk again. And, you know, on top of all of that, there's the other complications that come with spinal cord injury. I would have said, no way, I'm not the kind of person that could do that. And so I would always come back to people and say, you just don't know what you're capable of until you go through it. And you're tougher than you think, actually. I think people don't realize they don't. If you don't know how resilient you are, I almost want to say I'm lucky. You're lucky, but also rest assured you are more resilient than you realize. So
yeah,
don't be
that's
fearful.
so true of many people, isn't it, Sophie? I think we just don't know what we're capable of.
I think
Absolutely.
so.
Yeah. You've talked there about attitudinal challenges, which must be, and you see it still today, right? I think whilst there's been progress, I think there's a huge amount we still need to do, particularly around kind of understanding disability and the impact for disabled people. What are the most common misconceptions that you come across that people go, oh, they're disabled, this must be true? You know, there must be, go myth bust for us, Sophie, because there must be so many misconceptions about disabled people.
I always feel like saying, how long have we got? It's so it's so nuanced. So I would say, generally speaking, a lot of the time, the tropes that exist around disability are so inaccurate. So we kind of often, as advocates, sort of split them into, I suppose, maybe three. There's the sort of the stereotype of us that's the kind of pitiful one. Our life is tragic, and it's heartbreaking, and it's isolated, and it's lonely, and it's all those kind of negative, like your life stops when you have a disability kind of sense. There's that trope. Then there's the complete opposite, which is you are an inspiration. And we often see disabled people used as what an activist called Stella Young referred to as inspiration porn, which is this kind of concept. I think it's a wonderful use of terminology, because the use of porn, we all understand what porn is. It's sort of objectifying of a certain person for the gain of somebody else. And I think that is what happens with disabled people. Often our stories get used to make non-disabled people feel better about themselves. Look at her, she's so inspiring. If she can go to the gym, I can. What's your excuse? That kind of rhetoric. Yeah. And we see that played out often in storytelling. And it was almost, we can use the example, for example, of the Superhuman campaign that was used by Channel 4 to promote the Paralympics. Now, whilst that was really effective at getting bums on seats and eyes on TV screens for the games itself, the problem with that trope is that actually, whilst those people might be superhuman in their sport and superhuman in their, athletic achievement, in reality, they are just as human as anyone else. Some of them can't even get on the train or can't get a job outside of the Paralympics. And they have very real, normal human problems, if not kind of slightly extreme problems. And I'd say that's a damaging trope as well, the inspiration. And the last trope I'd say, which is really frustrating, is almost like you see it played out in films a lot, that disabled people are these sort of angry, destructive characters. We're often pitched as the villain. So you'll see disabled people in, for example, there's a very visual metaphor that you see in, like, I don't know, James Bond, where the baddie is disabled in some capacity. Maybe they're missing an arm, an eye, or they've got scars. They've got some trauma backstory that makes them angry at the world and burn the world down. And that angry disabled person trope, I mean, if you bring into intersectionality into this and you layer in gender and ethnicity into that as well, that further proliferates the problem. Because reality is we can embody all three of those tropes, and also none of them, and also some at the same time as others, the same as anybody else. But we often get this very binary kind of people we get stuck in these boxes. And so it doesn't allow us to just be normal human beings. And I think that's the problem. And that's what we want to try and tackle. And that's what authentic representation is all about. It's, for example, showing, yes, I can have an amazing job and do amazing things as a wheelchair user. And it's important that you know that, so that you don't you don't underestimate me. But at the same time, understand my access requirements and make accommodations for me because I have a disability. That's what equity is about. So it's understanding that kind of, yeah. So, I mean, but there's many, many more. If you dig into the specific subsections of disability as well, each one will have a different misconception about it. You know, that, for example, if you have a learning disability, that you can't hold down a job, or if you're a wheelchair user, you're wheelchair bound, or oh gosh, there's so many.
Yeah. And it's a reminder for us all, really, to try and understand it and see past it and see the person, right?
And
I think
hard.
that's the thing. It's difficult.
I think the thing is, it's there's an unconscious bias that we don't know how to address, and so that's where, yeah, it's hard to check, but it's important that we try.
Absolutely, completely agree with you. And you work tirelessly, Sophie. I mean, the list of things we talked at the intro is just some of what you do, right? You work completely tirelessly as an advocate for disabled people. Where do you get your motivation from, and what keeps you going? What drives you as a person?
I think I just don't have any choice. Sometimes I sit there and I'm exhausted and I think, what am I doing? What would I do if the world was actually accessible and disabled people had equal access to all of the goods and services and all of the experiences that we want to? What would I do with my time? And I know what the answer to that is. I would paint, and I would, do something for me probably. But the reality is, I step outside of my front door and there's a fight on my hands. There's always a fight. There's always something to do. I've taken that fight to the airlines recently because, as I mentioned before, my wheelchair got broken by an airline. And so my fight is there. My focus is there now. But over the years, it's been different causes, different issues, from the driving test for not being fit for purpose to trying to make retailers pay attention to the disabled demographic, to working with television to try and make it more inclusive. I mean, the list goes on. There's so many areas that we can focus. And I think my motivation comes from the very fact that if we don't do it, no one's going to do it. Change is not happening quick enough. And there are very real consequences to a lack of change, because I've lived it. I know what it's like. Your life ends, and it does really end if you don't have certain privileges around you to be able to live your life as a disabled person. So these causes, these missions, it's not just for fun, it's for life. It's life or death in some situations. I remember doing a campaign about, for example, the shackling or chaining of disabled people in West Africa, because there aren't the resources in the community to be able to support people with disabilities. And when somebody does have a disability, they get sent to a prayer camp, where those camps resort to prayer to try and fix people, heal people. And often children, as a result, get chained up because it's really dark. And the reason I bring that up as an example, we did the work there, because if you don't do the work there, what happens? And that's just, it's like, it's really obvious. But also I'm campaigning for air travel to be accessible. Now, you might not think that's really that important, but what that means at the moment is there's a group of young disabled children who are going to age out of being able to fly because they can't sit on their parents' laps and they can't leave their wheelchairs. That group of children will then not be able to work for certain companies if they can't fly, or go to certain places with their friends. So they miss out on life. So therefore, their life becomes lesser. So it's not life or death in that situation necessarily, but it's certainly about the quality of life and choice. And I think that's something that means you can't stop until it happens, because it's just not okay. It's not okay. Yeah.
Yep, it's not okay. You're absolutely right. It's not okay. Keep fighting the good fight. In IAmRemarkable week, I think, look, we're sometimes a little bit shy, aren't we, about talking about our own achievements. I think we're all quite good at recognising achievements in others. You got any tips about how do you kind of get comfortable with and share your own achievements? Because, it is difficult, right? We've all been there. It's difficult.
I'm as bad as everyone. Honestly, Sandy, I'm as bad as everyone. I think in truth, I will talk a good game here and say, be proud, be who you are. But let's be honest, everyone has their doubts about how, I don't know, that imposter syndrome concept, or that like, how have I got, I mean, I certainly constantly question how on earth I got where I've got. It always feels to me I'm out of my lane, out of my depth, completely and utterly, like we say in the UK, blagging it, you know? And it's funny, since I've moved to the US, firstly, they don't know what blagging is. And I think that's really interesting. Every time I say blag, I'm met with blank stares. What's a blagger? Yeah. And I have had to find out the definition of that. Now, obviously, that's a complicated word. It's not we're not all blagging. That sounds a bit malicious, but there's an element of that kind of us feeling as Brits, like we stay in our lane, we stay in our box. We don't. It's a cultural mindset, and I think if you come here, people are very comfortable talking about their success and their achievement, and they show it off a lot more, whether that be in the car they drive or the accessories they carry or wear. People are very much more comfortable with their success. Here, and I'm learning about that. I'm learning that actually things like it's okay to contact people out of the blue and say, look, this is who I am. This is what I want to achieve. I think I'd be good at it and you should listen to me. You know, whereas in the UK, you never, oh my gosh. Yeah. And it's quite a brazen thing to do, certainly of certain generations. And I'm nearly 40. I suppose I carry with me some learned behaviors from an older generation where you just don't put your head above the parapet, perhaps. But maybe that will change with the younger generation, hopefully so. But I'd say to anyone who's kind of like got that sense of, I don't know how I feel remarkable. I have to say there's also, it's funny, people often say to me, you know, what are you most proud of? And I think there's an assumption that I'm going to say, oh, I don't know, something big. I don't know, something big that I've done that people would deem as successful. I don't know, being a TV presenter or something. I have to say the thing I'm most proud of in my whole life, about the thing I would say I'm remarkable for probably, is keeping going, just keeping going. When I'm really tired and physically drained and my spinal cord injury is killing me and I'm really up against it and I'm struggling emotionally and I've had another knockback or setback or somebody said something harmful or hurtful or, you know, I'm not, you know, I don't know, my relationship is broken up with another guy or a girlfriend and I've had a row or something as simple as that. And then I'm like, no, I just keep going. I just keep going. And that's, so I'd say, the reason I say that is because I don't think people need to have this list of big achievements to feel good about themselves. Just, it can be anything small that I don't know, people say that like just getting up in the morning. And I think certainly that's true of disability more than ever. I mean, I've got friends who live with chronic health conditions, chronic fatigue. And honestly, getting out of bed is like,
big deal.
It's their Everest. And I'm like, they don't get enough credit for that. Yeah. And I find that, like, I just think we need to just have our own metrics for success and for our own metrics of what we think is important and nobody else is. And we just say, right, no, I'm a pretty good person. IAmRemarkable said this the other day on ITV. I don't know when it was. She said it but I saved it on my phone. She just she said this little piece to camera. IAmRemarkable, if people don't know who I'm talking about, is a brilliant actress. She's hilarious. She's in her 80s and she does not care about what people think about her anymore. Although she does admit that she does have that sensitivity, but she often just says what she thinks. And she says to the camera, she's looking at camera, she's just saying, basically, just when you go out the door in the morning, just remind yourself, you haven't done anything bad, you haven't killed anybody, you haven't hurt anybody, you're doing your best, and you're good enough. And that's enough. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And I love her for it. It's just so honest and simple. You're not a bad person. You're doing your best. Keep going.
I agree. I think that's spot on. And it's a nice reminder, isn't it? Because I think particularly in the world of social media, it's so easy to compare our path with other people's path. And actually, you know, I say it to my children, actually, Sophie, quite a lot, which is that just to be kind and be a good human being
it's enough.
Is good, right? It's enough. Yeah. It's enough. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. One of the things I'm reflecting on as you talk is around, look, we all need to be allies. You know, it's great that you're out there fighting the good fight and many others like you, Sophie, and it's incredibly admirable, but we need to show up. So what can we all do as allies, in your mind, to step into that space and give more disabled people a voice?
I think, firstly, thanks for asking the question. I think it's always the question that we want to hear. I think one of the things that we struggle with as a community is, well, it's twofold. One is we are dealing with, on top of the fight for equity and equality and inclusion, we're dealing with our own bodies, and often our spoons, as we call it, or our energy reserves, or our physical health gets in the way of that fight. And that's a problem, in that it means that we do need allyship perhaps more than other groups that might not have that actual physical barrier in front of them from being able to just get up and do the work every day. And it does take work every day. So I think we need that as a group probably more than ever and more than most. I'd say the other part of this is there are groups doing so much work, but forgetting that disabled people sit in that community too. And so I, for example, often I'm, as a feminist, follow, a lot of important people doing important work. And we'll see, for example, actually recently, Pride was put on and it wasn't accessible here in the States. And often people talk about Pride events around the world not being accessible, and whether that's be a physical space or events online. So you're talking about a whole group of people who identify as proud of their identity. And in that group are disabled people, but they're overlooked. And I think that's something I would say, if you are doing the work in your space, please don't forget about the disabled people in your space too. I'd also say, as an ally, wherever you go and whatever you do, whether that be at work, whether that be at, you just pop in for a coffee, whether that be, I don't know, getting on a flight, whether it's going to a concert, whether you're in a boardroom, whatever environment you're in, ask yourself a couple of questions. And I think I kind of bring them down. I took this from Sinead Burke, who's a brilliant campaigner who, if people don't know her work, check her out. She's fantastic. And I think she's right in saying it's 2 questions. Ask yourself, is this accessible? And that can be as simple as, for example, do we have captions? Are there interpreters? Whatever it might be, right? Is this accessible? Is there a ramp into this cafe? No, I don't say, well, why don't you just ask the manager? Have you ever thought about putting a ramp in here or having one at the back so that people who come here can access this space as well? Whatever you might want to do, this more obvious. The other part of it is asking who's not in the room when you're making decisions about things. Because I think so often people, we have this adage, nothing about us without us. And people often kind of try to do right by the disabled community, but they won't bring in disabled people into that effort. And a prime example is, for example, hotels. So often hotels have got accessible, compliant rooms, but they're not actually accessible properly. They haven't been designed by disabled people. So you'll see a shower with a shower seat put into it, but the shower head is on one side and the shower seat is on the other. So if you're sitting on that seat, the water doesn't reach you. And it's a prime example of they've tried to do the work, but they're not doing it effectively. And that's as damaging as not doing it. So I'd say those kind of questions are really good to keep in the back of your mind. Yeah. And if you don't know how to answer, or I'd say also the last point I'd make, just go online and follow advocates and people who, because I think often there's a big fear around disability that prevent people from asking questions and doing the right thing because they just don't want to get it wrong. And that's very British of us and very human of us. Mm-hmm. But I'd also say, if you want to learn about something, a group of people that you don't know how to approach, you don't have any in your close circle, or you just don't know where to start, that is what social media is amazing for. I follow groups of people who I will probably never meet, just so I can understand their circumstances better. I'll follow people who educate me. Social media should be not a place where we go and become competitive and threatened and insecure. It should be a place where we go to connect and get educated. And that's what we must implore in everyone, I think, is because if we curate the right feeds on our social media, we will learn infinitely about so much more. And imagine if we started giving power on social media to the right kinds of people, making sure we follow people who are voices of communities that, let's say we don't have Kim Kardashian as the most followed person, but we have I don't know, Baisan, who's the journalist who's reporting from the ground in Palestine right now. That, you know what I'm saying? It's like
I do.
Power. And I think,
I agree.
anyway, I'm getting off track a little bit, but if you don't know where to educate yourself, go on social media and do your Googling and do your research, because we also can't educate everybody. But at the same time, that's what this social media is for. Follow us, and hopefully you'll learn enough to feel confident enough to be able to do the work as well.
I think it's a great tip. Get curious. And I've started doing that myself, actually. It's something I recommend to people now, which is I got so sick of the usual social media dross that we get subjected to. I unfollowed loads of people and refollowed people I found kind of, I didn't know, got a different, and my world has changed ever since. And you kind of don't, you're not mindlessly scrolling, you're learning all the time. So it's a great tip, actually. And it's something we shouldn't underestimate, because it could be social media for good.
Yeah.
Completely agree. Completely agree. You briefly mentioned a couple of things about why you moved to the States. Sunny LA. The sun will be one of them, Sophie. I'm sure. Standing here in Scotland, we don't get the same. We don't get the same sunshine.
No.
What was the big decision point for you? Why did you move across, and how are you finding it?
I moved here because I was coming here a lot with work. At the time, it was potential work. It wasn't concrete work. It was hopeful, right? I was sort of testing the waters, and there was a few things bubbling away, some relationships forming, some interesting stuff happening. And I thought, wow, I also saw there's potential here to do what we did in the UK with the Paralympics, and use those games as a force for good to change societal views of disability. Because the LA Games are coming. The Paralympics will be here and the Olympics in 2028. So I thought there's an opportunity to maybe take my learnings that I had over from the UK and bring them to the US. So I don't know. I was exploring, right? Putting feelers out, as we say. And every time I came here, I noticed something about myself, that I actually liked myself more. I was enjoying my own self more. I wasn't so angry. I wasn't so frustrated. I think I found this sort of side of my personality. I was like, wow, I'm actually a lot calmer, a lot like funnier. I'm a lot, or certainly more willing to laugh. I'm a lot more like smiley. What's that about? And I realized quite, profoundly, it's the wheelchair access. I don't have to worry about wheelchair access here in California. It's accessible. I don't have to think about old buildings taking priority over my life. I feel the same as everybody else. I can go to a waiter at a restaurant and say, "Where's the loo?" instead of, "Do you have a loo?" Those are foundational, fundamental, transformative differences in a person's life. It's basically what I'm fighting for. It's equity. And the reason this has come around is because of the ADA laws that have been fought for here tirelessly by campaigners. And I mean, there's a lot of work still to do. There's nothing perfect about this place. Obviously, there's much, much more. And of course, it goes without saying, I suppose, but I'll say it anyway, that what we have in the UK with the NHS and what we have here in the US with healthcare is very, very, very unfair on the disabled community, and it's complicated. So I wouldn't say it's perfect here, but for me as a wheelchair user, it's been phenomenal. I love it. I don't know how I'm going to come back, to be honest, but I come back a lot, but I don't know how I can unsee it now.
Yeah.
I went to Soho in central London not long ago for a meeting, and I was just rolling around, and it occurred to me, despite having lived in London for 20 years, I hadn't fully seen that as I looked around, there was not one step-free building in that circle of small, that what's the word I'm looking for? Section of London. Those 5 or 6 streets, Wardour Street, Dean Street, big important streets in central London. None of them had step-free access. Wow. And I just thought, what does that tell you? And also 10 Downing Street doesn't have step-free access. What does that tell you? So I'm just over it. I'm over being told you can't do it. Yeah. Good for you. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it. That's great.
Thank you. I'm very excited to ask you the next thing, which is about you're working with Reese Witherspoon's production company. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing there? I'm very excited to hear about this.
Yeah, it's amazing. So Reese Witherspoon set up a production company called Hello Sunshine with the intention of shifting the narrative around women's stories, really. It's very much about centering women in an authentic way. She did that because Hollywood was sending her scripts that were the women just were not representative of the women she knew and she knew, should be on screen. So she set up a production company and started making scripted and unscripted shows, often inspired by books that she also chooses in her and selects for her book club, which is brilliant. Recent book club. So Hello Sunshine have an unscripted department in the UK. And I started working with them because it's headed up by a friend of mine who I met when I was working at Channel 4. And we were working on ideas. And we basically started making a production together, co-producing. I set up a production company called Making Space Media. And we started co-producing a documentary, Hello Sunshine and Us. And then that formed into a partnership and what we would call a first look deal, which means that when I have ideas that either involve myself or other disabled talent, we are able to take it to Hello Sunshine for them to review. And if they like it, they'll work on it with us. If not, then we can take it elsewhere. So it's been it's an opportunity of a lifetime. And I'm so grateful for them. They're the best. I have infinite respect for that company and for the brand and for everything that they are about. They are role models for me. So it's really amazing to be under their wing. So we're now hopefully going to be creating a feature-length documentary about some other stuff, which I can't go into, and cooking up lots of ideas. So it's really fun.
Amazing. And quite honestly, Reese Witherspoon is lucky to have you as well, Sophie. I'm just going to say that now. Now, the time has disappeared. I don't know if we've got any audience questions, first of all. We've got a couple more questions. Oh, here we go. I've got a few comments coming in. So, Sophie, you're really inspirational. Do you ever wonder what life would be like now without your injury? Or do you feel that you found your purpose as an advocate of disabled people? Great question, Lynn.
Thanks, Lynn. I'd say I do wonder what life would be like without my injury. Less and less so over the years. I used to fixate on it when I was first injured and could make comparisons, and it was really unhealthy. As they say, comparison is the thief of joy. And I did constantly compare myself to my old life. And that was painful. I don't do it so much anymore, but I do think about it every now and again. I often wonder where I'd be and what I'd be doing. But I don't really mind. I don't really care. It's like I equate it to me asking somebody who's a mum, do you ever wonder what your life would be like without your kids? And I just think it's one of those things. Now, I'm not saying disability and kids are the same. I'm just saying there's similarities in the fact that, yeah, you might, but you can't change it. So you don't. So it's just one of those. So I think I do and I don't, if that makes sense. And I'd say to your other question about, have I found my purpose? 100%. And that's one of the things why, that's what, you asked me earlier, Sandy, like, what's my motivation? I'd say my purpose. I'm very purpose driven. And I think rightly or wrongly, I believe that perhaps I survived my injury and sustained my injury because I have a reason to be here. And maybe that's something I should pay attention to and try and do something about it. I might be wrong, but it certainly keeps me going. And I really get a kick out of the work I do to make change. It's exhausting, but I don't think it's really nice repurposing the sort of fight and drive I have in me for good, because it can be a self-destructive sort of trait if you're not careful. I was quite a rebellious and difficult girl when I was little. And I think that trait in me got repurposed into sort of doing good. And I really I enjoy it. So yeah, I think that's
nice question, Lynn. Do we have any others online? Cherie, do you have a favourite quote that you could share with us, Sophie?
No, my mind's going to go blank. Always is the case, isn't it? When there's I'm trying to think of my favourite quotes from, not off the top of my head. I'm constantly, I read a lot of poetry. I can't recite it because I'm terrible at retaining that kind of information. I'd say Maya Angelou, a lot of what she talks about, certainly the cage bird. So Maya Angelou wrote about the fact that when Maya Angelou, she's a poet, people don't know who she is. She's she's passed now, but she was the most extraordinary speaker. And she was mute for a time when she was a young woman because of sexual assault. And she found her voice eventually and then became a poet. Anyway, she has an amazing turn of phrase, always. Everything she writes, it blows my mind. But one of the things she talks about is she knows why the cage bird sings. I know why the cage bird sings. And it's a whole poem, and I can't recount it. But anything from that poem, I'd probably say, is up there. I think that idea of knowing what it feels like to be caged and trapped, but find your voice and sing, I think is something I identify with. So probably that. And now I'm just going to think if there's any others that I love. And I can't think of any. I'm sure I'll remember and come back.
No, I liked your Miriam Margolyes one. She's an absolute legend. I love Miriam, actually. She's got some really nice ones. If you take the expletives out, which are the
I know. I'm really bad. I swear a lot. And I think her quotes are brilliant. Yes.
They're so good. They're so good. Do you have any other questions online? What are you most proud of achieving in your advocacy work?
I'd say getting to a point where I've advocated well enough that I'm making documentaries about my work. That feels really good. And then hopefully using those documentaries to make change. But I'd also say there was a win last year, although with the election looming, it was a win and then it wasn't. We influenced some change in the way that the airlines would be treated if they were to fail disabled people, which was a win. So I think my advocacy in my airline work is probably what I'm most proud of, but I've certainly got a long way to go. So I find that a hard thing to answer because my goals are big and I haven't achieved them yet. So, but yeah, I think the fact that I'm able to have people follow the journey and want to follow that journey and be interested in that feels like a win.
Great. I'm going to do one final question, if that's okay. Oh, we're getting lots of brilliant session. Thank you for engaging chat, Sandy and Sophie. You're welcome. It's been a pleasure. I could talk to you all day, Sophie. If you, we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to end us on a high, if you don't mind. I'm very excited about your Paralympic broadcasting role. Could you just give us a couple of minutes and then I'll take us to the close, but maybe just talk a little bit about that because it's super exciting, if you don't mind.
Thanks. I mean, yes, I'm so excited. So I did come to America with this dream of maybe I could become somebody who's on screen representing disabled talent and do what I did in the UK, which is find a way in through the Paralympics and use that effectively. And so I'm so excited that I'm doing that with NBC, and I'm one of a group of new disabled talent that's been recruited to host and report on the game. So I'll be in studio. I'll be the sort of, if you're watching this from the UK, the Claire Balding, the person who's in the studio, right? The anchor. So yeah. I'm really overwhelmed because that's it's the highest in the sense of hierarchy of broadcasting. I just can't, I'm very excited about that on a professional level, on a personal level, but it's also kind of wild that we are the first disabled people to be doing it. The other part of it, which is really exciting for me and a bit of I suppose actually maybe even answers your question about the advocacy work and what I'm most proud of, is that the people who also I'm working alongside, some of them I recruited and trained with NBC to be new talent, and they got the jobs. So we hosted Making Space, the company I've set up over here, set up a training camp with NBC to bring in new talent. And we recruited them, we identified them, we recruited them. NBC brought along some of the people that they really wanted to too. And we took these aspiring hosts and I trained them over 3 or 4 days. And then the NBC were left to select those that they thought would be potentially good enough to be able to host. And one of them is actually going to be hosting at the Olympics, which is amazing because we're seeing their representation in non-disabled space. But yeah, the rest are going to be working all together. So I'm really excited.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And final wrap, you've talked about what makes you remarkable and about the keeping going. Would that be what you would leave us with? What makes you remarkable, Sophie?
That I don't let my limitations, whether they be self-imposed or otherwise, stop me, and that I just keep going and going.
And thank goodness for that, because you're amazing. So that's a wrap. This is the wrap event for IAmRemarkable week. Thank you so much, Sophie. I literally could talk to you all day. It's been amazing just getting a real insight into all the stuff you're doing, your life, and what we could all be doing as well, right? This is a bit of a call to action. So what can we do? All of the IAmRemarkable events are on the YouTube page. You'll see the website at the bottom there, IAmRemarkable.org. Please take a look. Have a look, get involved in a workshop if you have not participated in one, and keep spreading the joy about the achievements, folks. But that's us done. Thank you so much, Sophie. Lovely to see you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.